very much for coming. Look, we've got a balcony. We've got an overflow crowd. This is exciting. Welcome to Oglethorpe University. For those of you who have not visited us before, I hope this won't be the last time. My name is Elizabeth Peterson. I'm the director of the museum here. And I just wanted to give you a little backdrop on this display. Now, obviously, the manuscript, if you haven't seen it, and we're now beginning the lecture, after the lecture you'll have ample time to take a look. This is an incredible item that we own, and we're very honored to have it. It's the experimental confirmation of the general theory of relativity. It was an appendix to larger writing by Einstein, but we've got the actual handwritten document. You'll see his corrections and just drawings, and it's amazing to have this thing. So have a look at that. There are many, many other events, and we're really proud to be part of the Atlanta Science Festival and grateful for the partnership. And this year we've gotten even more involved, so we've got students in studying ornithology who are part of the trip with Dr. Donnelly to Chattahoochee, and all kinds of good things going on. I also just want to mention too, we've got many other exhibits happening. If you're interested, Azadi, this is a Persian art, and we also have Georgia Watercolor Society National Exhibition. So the student that I'm about to introduce, I keep telling him, you're the talent, I'll get you the water, don't worry, you're good. But seriously, he is a very talented person, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, I love being at this university. A student who really understands what Oglethorpe brings, will grab a hold of every opportunity, the way Antonio Mántica has, and do as much as possible and be a real Renaissance person, and he has done that. So he's a member of ODK. He is involved in as an honors council of the Student Government Association. I've got to look at notes, there's too much. His resume is longer than mine. I'm really liberal. He's been a presenter at the Liberal Arts and Sciences Symposium, at the American Chemical Society's Southeastern Regional Meeting. He's a member of Sigma Zeta, the Society of Physics Students, and apparently he's also rehearsing in Romeo and Juliet in his spare time. So, but just a really dynamic young man. We're really pleased and proud to have him talk. He's also the second student to ever lecture as part of the museum series, and we do not want this to be the last time a student is involved. So we're very committed to student involvement here. Antonio.
Thank you guys, thank you. I promise I'm all hype. No, thank you for that lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to it. Thank you, first of all, to the Museum of Art and to the Oglethorpe Physics Department that has produced me and got me here. And coffee, thank you for coming. So, we'll deal with a brief PowerPoint.
It's just working until you touch it.
This is where you use your improv skills.
This is where I do. Thank you. Good night.
You may have to begin without any visuals. We'll see what we can do.
That's fine. We can start. Anyway, so welcome to the lecture, a tour through time. To tell you a little bit about myself, I'm originally from Indiana. I'm usually hesitant to tell large crowds that because there's almost always someone who goes, Indiana, I'm from there too. And we're related somehow, and we both talk about that one time that we met Larry Bird. And it's just a conversation I'm not ready to have today. I'm a physics major here at Oglethorpe. I love it. I work closely with Dr. Rulison and Dr. Kramer, the two physics professors here. And in the fall, I will be attending PhD school to study nuclear physics. So that's pretty exciting. What today's lecture is a culmination of is two things, really. The first is a course that I took as a freshman here that was called Cosmologies of Cultures, which was sort of a tour, if you will, through different cultures throughout history and how they viewed the heavens, how they viewed cosmology, essentially, and what they thought about time. So what I've done and what I will do in the first half of today's lecture is outline 8 societies, 8 cultures that I think each express a really cool quality and a really cool new approach to thinking about time. Different ways, different models to explain it, whether or not time has a beginning, whether or not time has an end, whether it's cyclical, things like that. So we'll get all into that as well. And then the second half of what I'm going to do tonight is talk about modern conceptions of time. What happened when Isaac Newton first said, I think that there's absolute time and then the relative time, things like that. And then we're going to talk about how Einstein sort of shattered our conception of what we thought that was and what we thought that meant. And then briefly at the end we'll talk about the future of time, if you will, to use a really weird phrase, and what we have left to discover about it. So we'll go to our first slide. So not to say that time is irrelevant, but it's something that's really hard to define. It's something that a lot of cultures have struggled with, something that a lot of scientists and philosophers have struggled with. And it's almost every piece of academic writing you'll read about time always begins with an obligatory opening chapter of lists of definitions and what I mean when I say X, Y, Z. And so you can talk about the motion of the planets, which we will. You can talk about the sequences of events, whether or not time is just defined as things that are cause and effect, or anything like that. But time is something that's pretty important. I mean, it's used in all fields. It's used in sports. It's used in science. It's used in just about everything. We measure it, right? And we travel through it already, right? We're all traveling through time right now. But what does that mean? So we'll explore that, I promise. So, but first, let's start looking at, let's begin our tour, and our first stop is the Paleolithic era, about 34,000 years ago. What we have here is a bone fragment, or a horn or a tusk fragment, that has these markings on it, and it's the first indication that human beings are aware of their surroundings in the sense that this is a lunar calendar, is what this is. It's the first indication that humans have witnessed that the moon is going through these cycles, going through the cyclical motions, and recording it. And it's pretty neat. I mean, it looks primitive to us, but this could be an incredibly useful thing to have. Some people say that the primary purpose of this was probably to be used, to predict women's ovulation cycles. But nevertheless, I feel like this is important to highlight because it's the first instance that we have, historically speaking, that says humans are starting to think about time and starting to think about the passage of events and seasons. So, pretty cool. So then, taking another step historically, we will get to Stonehenge. About 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, it was when Stonehenge comes up. And what this is something that is framing the solstices and the equinoxes, and the equinoxi, or however you want to pluralize that. But in brief, what those are is, if you go outside and you draw a line in the dirt where the sun sets every day, you'll see it go tick, 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 all the way to one side, and then all the way to another. And it'll go back and forth like that. And so the days that the sun sets on the farthest end and then on the other farthest end are what we call the summer and winter solstices. And when it passes in the middle are what we call the equinox. Because on those days there are 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness. And this is also why days seem longer, because they are longer in the summer, and shorter in the wintertime. And what's interesting about this is that it's the first sort of piece of archaeological evidence that we have that now, not only are humans not thinking about the moon going through cycles, but we're also now thinking about the sun. And just as an addendum, archaeological evidence sort of suggests that the winter solstice was the time that was celebrated at the specific site of Stonehenge. Why? I don't know. If anyone has any good guests, come up to me afterward and we can chat about it. And things like that. So moving on, once again, on our next stop on our tour through time is this, and what this is a Babylonian lunar calendar is what we're looking at. So this is in a region referred to as Mesopotamia, around the Tigris-Euphrates River area, what would be modern-day Kuwait and Iraq and Syria, things like that, places like that. This is about 2,000 years ago, just about. And what's cool about the Babylonian lunar calendar is that this is the first calendar that breaks up a year. So remember, with the sun ticking and the equinoxes, a year is obviously when it reaches one point and then comes back to the same point. But the Babylonians were the first culture that divided it up into 12 lunar months. So now not only do we have something that says, hey, we're starting to see that there are cycles in the moon and in the sun, but we're now combining them together and making calendars for the first time. And of interesting note, the Babylonian calendar, the year begins on the spring equinoxes, and they talked about, there's writings about a belief in the end of the world, but there's nothing concrete, and they don't really say anything about the beginning of time. So you can sort of, if you're following along with me here, you see that as these cultures are developing, we have another step. There's always one more step further where a culture says, well, maybe there was a distinct beginning of time, or maybe time isn't quite cyclical, or maybe time does have a distinct ending. And so we'll get into more of that later when we move into a strictly cyclical time, which is our next one, which is ancient Indian cosmology and ancient Indian culture. So what's really cool about the Hindu perception of time is that the units are, to us, fantastically small, and then their large units are fantastically large. So you can look at this and see they have a unit of time that's defined as a paramanu, if you'll excuse my English version of pronouncing that word, which is that many seconds, and it's pretty insignificant. And a lot of these have religious connotations, but they're really breaking it up, you see here. And this is also cool because now, not only have they broken up the year into 12 months, this is also the first culture that broke up weeks into 7 days. So we're kind of taking big chunks of time and chopping them into more and new defined things. And so although the Hindu time day, began at the sunrise, this is more or less a strictly lunar calendar. And they defined, so you can see a Brahma day, this is the important one to bring up. A Brahma day correlates to roughly 2,000 years of our time. And they define what are these great epochs, or epochs, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And so this whole thing, this process goes, and these epochs rise and they fall, and instead of year to year following each other, what happens is the years sort of elapse over one another in the Hindu religion, in the Hindu perception of time. And they calculated an epoch, or an epoch, to be about 8.6 billion years long, which is pretty cool considering that modern science tells us the universe is about 13.7 billion years. So this is really cool because it's the first society that has said, not only are we breaking things down, but we're also going to start predicting. We're also going to start predicting things in the past, and we're also going to start predicting things in the future. And so not only do they predict the end of our current epoch, which our current epoch has only 432,000 years left, so get everything organized before then that you need to. They also have what they call the Great Epoch, which was when time began, which, according to our calendars, would be the 23rd of January, 3102 BC. So here we have a culture that has a distinct beginning of time, but now they have this idea that time is elapsing, that time is cyclical. And you may think that cyclical time sounds strange or sounds foreign, but if you start to think about it, it's not that weird. So if you think, you see the sun, and the sun goes through cycles, and you see the moon, and the moon sets and goes through the waxing and waning. The seasons come and go, and so everything in nature cycles. So it's not too weird to see a culture that says, well, maybe time functions the same way. Maybe that, I'm born a serf, let's say, and I live my life as a serf, surfing the land, and one day I'll die, and the time will just loop around again, and I'll be once again born a serf. So that's what's pretty cool about this perception of time. But we'll move on to the next one while we're doing this, into a pretty cool one. Excuse me while I take a sip of coffee. This is Greco-Roman time. So you can see here, this is just a picture of a sundial. A lot of the Greco-Roman time is based on what Aristotle said about time. And he said that time had no distinct beginning. He said it was infinite in the past. And his logic behind that was, if there was a nothingness in the beginning, which he said was impossible, but he said if there had been a nothingness, why should a universe have started when it did, or why should the universe have started where it did? And so to him, to Aristotle, there was no rhyme or reason as to why it should have been a specific place or at a specific time, and so it was impossible to believe that there was a nothingness. So he said, the past is eternal, there's an infinite past. And that gave rise to a little bit of debate. There are a couple of philosophers around the time who disagree with him, but what the major point of contention amongst that community in this time period is not the beginning of the beginning of time, but the end of time. This is the first time, the first big rise when people started to challenge cyclical time. When people started saying, well, maybe time isn't cyclical. Maybe it does have, maybe it didn't have a distinct beginning, but it might have a distinct end. And it's pretty cool. But then they've got some other cool things though. They, in the solar calendar, have divided the day up into 12 hours regardless of how long the day is. So we talked about how during the summer, days are longer, the sun spends more time in the sky, and during the winter, the day is shorter. Well, in the Greco-Roman world, an hour is about 45 minutes in the wintertime, and in the summertime, an hour is about 75. So, to me, that makes sense, because then you don't have to worry about the sun setting at 6:52 or 7:12 every night. It sets at the same time every night. And so, that's right. And so, for the Bible readers out there, you'll see things where they say Jesus was before Pilate at the 6th hour. And so there's a rather significant variance as to what time of year that was to when it could have been. So it's pretty cool. They also were the first culture to have the concept of a day beginning at midnight, which is neat, which we have today, of course. And since solar calendars, such as this one, don't work very well at nighttime, they divided the night into 4 watches. So again, this can also be seen throughout the Bible, where you say at the 4th watch or at the 3rd watch, which is 4. It's just 4 periods where that time is broken up, and that has carried over, as I learned today, into shipping and to people on ships and stuff like that. You hear about having 3rd watch, 4th watch, and things like that. But another really cool important thing that happened in about 46 BC, this guy that you've probably never heard of, named Gaius Julius Caesar, came forward and came up with this idea, along with the help of a guy named Sosigenes of Alexandria. He came up with this thing called the Julian calendar. And before this, the Greco-Roman world had a year that lasted 355 days, and then an alternating year of 377 days. And they went back and forth. But it was causing some issues. Dates were ending up on the wrong things over the years, and so Julius Caesar did a couple of radical things when he came into power. But one of those things was to establish this standardized calendar, this Julian calendar. And so what's really cool about this is that it's very similar to ours. They had 12 months, they had 365 days, and they even had a leap year every 4 years. So, yeah, I mean, this is the first big step into our sort of collective modern concept of how we break up time, how we break up the world as best we know it, or how we break up this time. Goes on. So our next big shift occurs in the early first century. It's about 500s, 600s, and what we're looking at here is now the Islamic golden age of science. And so, along with the rise of Christianity at this time, this is the first major sweep of people starting to believe that time was not cyclical at all, and that time had a very distinct beginning and will one day have a very distinct end. And you can imagine how attractive this looked to people like the serfs, who thought that they were born and they lived their life a lowly serf and would never achieve anything, and then they would die one day and then come back and be a serf again. But then here comes these religions, and here comes this new wave of thought that says, no, time began at a very distinct point, and time will one day have an ending. And then there's the whole eternal life business that comes along with that as well. But during the Islamic golden age of science, you get this really cool guy. His name is Al-Ghazali, and again, I may be pronouncing that wrong. And he is the first recorded instance of saying that there are infinite timelines in parallel worlds. And that the one that we live in, he said, was the best of all possible worlds, but that's a philosophical discussion for another lecture. But it's interesting to note that not only during this time, during this first century, are we transitioning into a sort of global thought of linear time, we're also starting to think about other timelines and think, well, maybe this isn't the only one, that there could be multiple that exist. So, I mean, that's pretty neat. I think it's pretty neat. And also the concept of eternal time, of eternal life after death, just in and of itself is a neat concept to think about first growing and first arising. So now, after this, we will switch into Norse time. Here you can see a very accurate painting of Nordic religion and culture. So each one of these cultures, what I'm trying to highlight here is new steps and new modes of thinking, and what they did was they were the first religion or the first thing that sort of had things existing before time begins. So I mean, really, what it is Odin and Vili and Ve, and my friend Don, who knows all about Norse religion, will correct my pronunciation of those as well, exist before the beginning of time, and they actually created time out of fire and ice, which seems crazy, I guess, to us. But they've created time, and they've existed, and they exist on the tree of life you may be familiar with if you know much about it, Yggdrasil, where there are 9 different worlds, and on these 9 different worlds, time runs at different paces. So you've got the Valhalla, where time is longer than it is here on Earth, things like that. So it's really interesting. So this is kind of coming in line again. Then this is also coming out of the first century, where you've got multiple timelines, different timelines running at the same time in different places, different worlds, different universes. And you have a distinct ending. And they also have a pretty distinct ending to time, known as Ragnarok, where a great battle occurs and people fight each other and get eaten by wolves, and there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. And after time ends, the same process starts over again, and the gods recreate time. So I just want to highlight that one because it's interesting, and it's pretty cool. But again, it's an example of cyclical time. They have cyclical time, but it stems out of that. So finally, the last society that we'll talk about before moving into modern conceptions of time is the pre-Columbian, basically the Mesoamerican concepts of time. What's really cool about this one is, yes, they have cyclical time. You may be familiar with the Mayan calendar and the big scare that the world was going to end in 2012. It didn't, thankfully. And so you may think, okay, well, they've got cyclical time, obviously. But it's not quite the same cyclical time as some of these other societies we've been looking at. What's cool about these pre-Columbian societies is that time, instead of flowing from one direction, from past to future, for them is an ever-present present, if that makes any sense. It's always there. There's just a continuous now that's happening for them, and they shift their calendars in a circle this way. So it's pretty cool. So these are sort of some of the highlights of cultures, and so in this time we're looking at pre-1492 time. So that's sort of bringing you from 34,000 years ago all the way to Isaac Newton, who we'll see next in time. So pretty cool. So modern conceptions of time. We have pictured here Isaac Newton, who suspiciously looks like James Edward Oglethorpe, and Immanuel Kant. And what's cool about these two is that Kant comes slightly after Newton, but they sort of have a relatively famous debate on how to define time. So what Newton does, Newton comes along and he says there are 2 different types of time. There are 2 ways, according to Newton, to define time, and these two ways actually stuck with us for a long, long time. Excuse the pun. Every time I say time, it's going to be a pun. He says, firstly, there's absolute time. And what absolute time is something that exists completely without regard to humans, completely without regard to measurement, without regard to space, without regard to anything. They're sort of, God's stopwatch that just goes and moves and is completely unaccessible and unmeasurable to us. The second time that Newton defines is what he calls relative time, which is the measurable time, which he explicitly says is the only one that can be understood mathematically, and it is measured by the duration of motion, is what he says. So this is, the motion of the sun, the motion of the moon, of two things colliding. It's the mathematical one that is dependent on space. That, if we say there are 2 seconds, or however many seconds occurred between two events, that some sort of motion had to happen there for us to measure that and make that a thing. So that was in 1687, but then in 1788, Immanuel Kant says that's all baloney. He says that's foolishness. He says time is nothing but the human conception of cause and effect. To Kant, the mind is just an input machine, that all it can do is take in data, and then there's some sort of magical properties of having a brain that puts definition to that input. And he says all it is the mind processing the data input, and that time is something non-analytic. He says it's just a pure form of intuition, of a sense that humans take in this data and say, I'm going to call this thing time. So this sort of debate exists amongst philosophers, of course, for the mathematics and physics community. We're happy with taking Newton's definition and using it in our formulas and things like that. But this holds for quite some time. Until 1905, when we get our hero that we love so much, Albert Einstein, on the cover of... Thank you. Einstein sort of smashes our conception of what time is and what we mean by when we say I experience time or how we move through it. So the famous example, and bear with me if you've heard this before, but the famous example is going to be about a train. And if we go to our next slide, we can see the train. Here we go. The train's name can be Thomas, if you'd like. So what Einstein says is this famous example of a train traveling close to the speed of light. And that you're an observer, so we can all be observers on the hill, and here's the train going at the speed of light. And by a miracle, both ends of the train are struck by a lightning bolt, by two lightning bolts, one on either end. And to us, all the observers sitting on the hill, of course, we say it was simultaneous. Both ends of the train were struck at the same time. However, the conductor on the train, who is in his own inertial frame, he's traveling close to the speed of light, he comes this way and sees the light approaching him from the first strike of lightning come first, and then the second strike of lightning come to him afterward. Does that make sense? Does everyone follow me? Right? So the conductor on the train says, the front end of the train got hit by lightning first, and then the back end. So in other words, there's a time discrepancy. So what Einstein does here is he disproves simultaneity in a sense. He says it's impossible for two events to be considered simultaneous when, depending on how fast you're traveling, you would observe them to be at different times. And it's important to note here that what Einstein isn't saying, or what Einstein is saying, is not that time itself is elongating or that it's changing for the observer. It's just that moving at different speeds makes two different independent observers measure a different amount of time happening between two events. It's time dilation is what it is. Events still happen chronologically. The chronological order of events doesn't change under relativity. It's just that two observers traveling at two different speeds in different inertial frames will measure different amounts of time happening between the same events. And that's a pretty important distinction, because we have a pretty big and confusing and new idea in the world here to approach. And so that means that clocks that are moving at faster speeds are ticking at a slower rate than clocks that are here on the Earth. And so, and they've experimentally done that. They've taken 2 atomic clocks and left one on the lab, and taken one on a plane, flown it around, and it's come back and it's shown different times. So, good job, Einstein. Pretty cool. He was more or less right. Another great anecdote. So this is a further step from that about what Einstein says is the connection between. We'll get to this. Yeah, that's fine. You can leave it there. We're stepping into the connection between space and time. So this all starts when Einstein is looking at a clock tower in Bern, the one we saw on the front slide there, and he starts to wonder, what would happen if I was suddenly hurled backwards from the clock at the speed of light? And so you can imagine the photons of light are hitting the clock and coming back and striking his eye. But as he's being hurled backwards at the speed of light, no new light from the ticking clock is ever coming toward his eye. It's always the same beam of light. So he's traveling, in a sense, with the same light that originally bounced off of the clock at the moment when he started traveling backwards. So, in a sense, time is stopped for him because he's seeing the same time on the face. He's not seeing it tick anymore. And this starts to get into the connection of space and time, otherwise known as space-time. So you can imagine yourself, you can stand still here on Earth, but you're traveling on Earth. So you can imagine yourself floating in the dead of space, not moving at all, and you're traveling 100% through time, right? If you aren't traveling through space at all, you're just floating there. The only direction that you're traveling through is, the only thing you're traveling through is time, right? And this is where we get the idea of calling time the fourth dimension. By no means is time a physical dimension that's accessible. We say it's the fourth dimension mathematically to say that you're moving through time as you're not moving through space. But, says Einstein, as you start to move closer and closer and closer to the speed of light, that starts to appear to you to be slowed down until you reach the speed of light, which he says you can't do. But when we reach the speed of light, time stops. Now he's seeing the same light from the clock hit him. So what we have here is sort of the best way to depict that. It's what's called a Minkowski diagram, where we have space, the three-dimensional space that we live in, compressed into 2 dimensions. And what here on the vertical axis is time, and what we have here is a light cone. Pretty interesting concept. But what this illustrates is that light takes time to travel, and it takes time to travel distances. And we can talk about how fast things are traveling and how that changes their light cone. But so just as an example to demonstrate what this means, there could be someone a foot away from you, 10 feet away from you. So like someone in the back there, if I wave to you, right? That light is coming to my hand, hitting my hand, and bouncing back to you. And that takes time. So that means by the time that you've seen me wave my hand at you, I've already waved. It already happened. You're sort of seeing into the past. You're seeing something that already happened. Now this, of course, is on a huge scale with stars that are incredibly far away, where they blow up and then we don't see it until significantly later. Or like if the sun was suddenly snuffed, we wouldn't know until 8 minutes because that light has to travel a distance. So that's what this is saying. So that's what if you can imagine, I'm waving to a friend across the street. Here's my friend a certain distance away from the street. He has a light cone that comes up as well, and where our light cones intersect is where we finally see each other. So on a across the street basis, it's arbitrarily 0. It's going to be something like 0 or 8 zeros in front of a number before seconds. That's how many seconds it would be before you saw something. But this is a revolutionary idea that Einstein had because he says time and space are connected. They are connected in the sense that he has this thing about the clock tower traveling away from the clock tower, and also in this business with the Minkowski diagram, as we can see here. So it's pretty neat. So we'll move on from there. We can talk about Minkowski diagrams for quite some time. But so this is not a Pink Floyd album cover. Don't let that fool you. This is a representation of a black hole, and so black holes create another step of doing something funky with time, because a black hole is more or less a singularity point, you can think of infinite mass, or of infinite density. Wording, we'll get it right. So an individual, let's say, I mean, if granted all the assumptions have to be made that you are invincible or in an invincible spacecraft as you're falling into the black hole, right? You don't want to, as politely referred to as spaghettification, where the gravity at your feet is significantly greater than at your head and you spaghettify. So assuming that you are invincible, like me, and falling into a black hole, the observer yourself, you would not experience a longer time or anything like that. That's not what if you recall, what relativity says is that it depends on how fast you're traveling for the inertial frame of the observer. However, to someone standing outside of the black hole, watching me, the invincible man, falling into the black hole, it takes an infinite amount of time for me to fall into that black hole. Just by nature of what we have in the mathematics of our understanding of black holes and things like that. So again, a pretty crazy wild card in the world of time, and as far as understanding time is concerned. But we'll keep going in the sake of time. What we have here is something that Stephen Hawking came up with. It's pretty neat. It's a little hard to understand at first, but I'm going to try and say it in a concise fashion. This is what he calls imaginary time. So here's on this axis, we have our time. This is the past and future. We're traveling through time. And perpendicular to it is imaginary time, where it's totally normal time, just like us. It's not imaginary in the sense that it's made up, but it's imaginary in the sense that, mathematically, it's imaginary and that we can interact with it. So you can see, let's say, here I am. This is right now, in the present. And here we are, we're all moving, tick, 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 and I start to move through imaginary time. Well, I'm no longer moving through our time, right? I've ceased to pass through the time that everyone here is passing through and started passing through imaginary time. And when I'm done with passing imaginary time, I pick up right up where I left off in our time. So really weird concept. It's kind of hard to explain at first, but it's really the easiest way I can explain it is that it's time that's just moving in a different direction. And if that doesn't confuse you, great. If it does, I'm more than willing to chat about it afterwards. So we'll move on. So briefly, at the end here, we'll talk about the future of time and what we have left to figure out about time. So this is HUL's time machine. It's great. And there are still some things left that we don't understand about time and things that we're trying to find out. For example, there's a lot of experiments going on about causality. And what causality is the idea that every cause produces an effect, every effect must have a cause. And so, this is sort of one of the earlier definitions, as you recall, was maybe time is just defined as a big, long series of causes and effects. So what modern day experiments are doing, and they seem paradoxical at first, but they're trying to disprove causality. So you've got these experiments where experimenters are trying to send wave packets through a gas, and part of that wave packet appears just slightly earlier than when they put it in. Things like that. So they seem paradoxical and they seem to violate causality at first, but when you really get into it and you start talking about what a wave packet really means and things like that, you can sort of work your way around most of these paradoxes. However, a really cool one and a really cool scientist who's been in the leading the push to discover time travel, his name is Ron Mallett. He's got this idea that if you bend a laser in a loop and it produces a gravitational field, and then shoot a neutron or a neutrally charged particle through that gravitational field, it'll experience what's called frame dragging, which I could get into, but that's another lecture. But his research, he thinks, will prove that there are things that are called closed time-like curves, which would mean that time travel into the past is possible. things like that, which are pretty cool. Now just to quote him, not me, he says that time travel will certainly be possible in the 21st century and quite possibly within the next decade. So that's Ronald Mallet, if you want to take that up with him. You can do that. I would love to see if that's true. But anyway, so finally, this is just a picture of a river. Not that I included it for nothing. I included it because Einstein's favorite way to describe time was to say it was a river. It's a series of points that are all moving in conjunction into the future. And so just finally, the big questions that are still left in the study of time is not just, is time travel possible? There's also a lot of research and a lot of people trying to figure out whether or not time is quantized. That means whether or not time does indeed flow continuously like a river, or whether or not there are distinct measurable ticks of time that pass and that occur, and that there's nothing smaller than that, what would be called a chronon, unless someone else discovers it and decides to name it something else. But there's also research in trying to discover what happened before the Big Bang, if there were things before the Big Bang, and there's also a lot of modern research going into humans' physiological perception of time. As we've talked about on some of the book readings, when you live in the countryside, the days sort of seem to go by slower, and when you live in the big city like the ATL, the days seem to go by pretty quickly. But that's about it. If you the final slide there. I hope I could have at least provided you with some cool ways we human beings, I hope everyone is, have thought about time and how we've viewed it and what the future has in store for us and our study for it and the pursuit of learning more about it.